Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Ford Presidential Library. My name is Elaine Didier, and it's my privilege to serve as the director of the library here in Ann Arbor and the museum in Grand Rapids. We are very pleased to have you with us tonight as we open our 2017 Fall Program Series, and I'm delighted that you're all so excited to be here that many of you were here very early, and we're going to have a lot of fun tonight. This evening's program is brought to you by the National Archives and Records Administration, which is our parent organization, with additional support from the Ford Presidential Foundation. We thank all of you who are members of Friends of Ford for your contributions to the foundation, which make programs like this possible. Now to tonight's speaker. Our speaker this evening is a person of amazing breadth and diversity who comes to us highly recommended none other than by my boss, the Archivist of the United States, even though we had already chosen him on our own. But it didn't hurt to have a little plug there. Adrian Miller is a writer, attorney, and the most important thing, a certified barbecue judge. How many of those have you ever met or heard from the Ford Presidential Library stage? After graduating from Stanford University and Georgetown University School of Law, Mr. Miller practiced law in Denver for several years. He became an assistant to President Clinton and then deputy director of President Clinton's Initiative for One America. Later, he served as general counsel and director of outreach for the Bell Policy Center, and then was legislative director for the Colorado Governor Bill Ritter, where he focused on homeland security, military, and veterans issues. That's all really, really good stuff, as you know. But the real reason he's here tonight is that he's not only an accomplished attorney and policy advisor, but a culinary historian. He has lectured around the country on such topics as black chefs in the White House, chicken and waffles, hot sauce, kosher soul food, think about that, kosher soul food, red drinks, soda pop, and of course, soul food itself. His book, titled Soul Food, The Surprising Story of an American Cuisine, One Plate at a Time, won the 2014 James Beard Foundation Book Award for Reference and Scholarship. And tonight he will be discussing his new book, which he has been sharing with you unabashedly with a recipe on the back that shows you. Please welcome Adrian Miller to the Ford Museum.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thanks, Elaine, for that great introduction. And thank you so much to the Ford Research Library staff for just making me feel at home and just making me feel welcome. It's so great to see all of you out here tonight. So what I'm going to do is first tell you about my journey, how I came to write this book on the history of black chefs in the White House. And then we're going to go through kind of the major categories of my book, because the way I decided to write my book, the way I decided to do it, was to focus on different types of cook and people involved in presidential food service. So we're going to have a lot of fun stories. I've got some family, friends, and aunts in the audience. I think I have everyone here except an ex-girlfriend. Yeah, okay, cool. So this is a picture of me in the White House kitchen. Has anyone here been in the White House kitchen? Okay, yes, you have. All right, what was the thing that really struck you the most being in the White House kitchen? The size, how small it is. It's only 26 by 30 feet. So it would actually fit in this room. The gentleman there with me is a guy named Adam Kollick, who was he's called the kitchen steward. So he's there to actually make sure that the kitchen equipment is working properly, but he does pitch in and help with the food. He's been working there since the Reagan administration. So it was just a pleasure to bring to light the stories of people that have been in the White House for such a long period of time. So let's start off with my journey. You got a little bit of a sketch of my bio. And when I basically came back to Denver and practiced law, this is not to disparage any attorneys in the audience, but it just wasn't for me. It got to the point where I was singing spirituals in my office. So I figured I needed to do something else. So I was actually going to open up a soul food restaurant, but then I got a call from a friend from Georgetown Law School who was working in the Clinton White House on something called the President's Initiative for One America. And she was asking me if I had friends back in DC who might be interested in that job. And I said, well, tell me about the job. And here was the idea behind the President's Initiative for One America, which was an outgrowth of his initiative on race. That if we just got together and talked and listened, we might realize that we have a lot more in common than what supposedly divides us. I know, crazy, right? So when she told me this job, I basically did the same thing that Dick Cheney did when George W. Bush asked him to find a vice president. I was the head of the search committee, only my name went on the list. So I got to the White House, loved my time there, worked on a lot of cool things. I think the only thing that kind of irked me a little bit is you've probably heard stories of people who meet President Clinton. He makes you feel like you're the only person in the room. I never got that. Every time I would meet with him, it would be just a blank stare. I'd say, Mr. President, blank look, kind of like the one you're giving me right now. I'm Adrian Miller, blank look. I work on your One American Initiative, and he's like, oh, that's great. And then, you know. So, really good time. So, fast forward, Clinton, thank you for laughing at that. I worked hard at that one. Fast forward, Clinton administration ends. At the change of administration, if you're a political appointee, what you have to do is you write out your letter of resignation, and then you offer it to the next president. It's up for them to decide whether they do, accept it or not. Shockingly, George W. Bush accepted mine. So I was out of a job, watching way too much daytime television. I said, I should read something. I went to the bookstore and I got a book on the history of Southern food written by a man named John Edgerton, who passed a couple years ago. And that book's called Southern Food at Home, on History, and in the Road. And when he wrote that book, early in the book, he said, the tribute to African American achievement in cookery has yet to be written. I thought that was fascinating. The book was about 10 years old when I read it. So I just emailed him cold and I said, Mr. Edgerton, you said this, you wrote this in your book. Do you still think this is true? And he said, yeah, for the most part, nobody's taken on the full story. So that launched me on the journey to write my book on the history of soul food. And as I was writing that book, people who, African Americans who cooked for our presidents started popping up in my research. And I just said, and there was only a few stories though. So I just said, if I could get enough stories together, that's the next book that I want to write. And so I then got to the President's Kitchen Cabinet. In my research, I've identified 150 African Americans who have cooked for our presidents from George Washington to the present day. And I know that I'm only scratching the surface because the records have not been that great. And to research the book, I read presidential biographies, autobiographies, biographies from staffers. I did go through every White House cookbook I could find. And I did manage to find some databases of old newspapers. And that was the gold mine, because the daily newspapers chronicle the daily life, right? And they were the ones that really talked about these hidden stories of African Americans in the White House. So that was really my primary source. Now, I did try to reach out to contemporary sources, chefs working in the White House and also ones that have recently left the White House. Of the ones that left the White House, none of the African Americans would actually talk to me, which was really frustrating and disappointing. Of the white chefs who are former White House cooks, they actually did talk to me a lot. In fact, they talked to me too much. They told me a lot of stuff I shouldn't even known. And I did reach out to the Obama White House, because I was writing this book at the time President Obama was in office. And not only did I get a rejection email, but 20 minutes later I got another one, just in case I got it twisted the first time around. So, it was difficult not to have primary contemporary sources, but I found a lot of secondary sources. So let's get to the book. So I describe the problem as what I call the presidential pickle. And the presidential pickle is this. We want our presidents to be extraordinary people, but we want them to be a lot like us. And often food is a nice window on the presidential soul to see if they have the common touch, if they're in touch with the people. Now, the pickle I chose to use is what we call a Kool-Aid, or a Kool-Aid pickle. Does anybody know about Kool-Aid pickles? Oh, man, okay. I'm going to digress for a second. Kool-Aid pickle is essentially, this is how you make one. You get a jar of already made pickles, open up the jar, take the pickles out. You can either poke holes in the pickles or cut them. And then you make Kool-Aid with the pickle brine. Okay, so instead of water, yes, don't stay with me. All right, so then you put the pickles in the pickle Kool-Aid brine, put it there, close the jar. You look like you're about to throw up. Leave it there for 2 weeks, take them out and eat them. If you like the taste of Kool-Aid and of pickles, it's just a sweet and sour combination. If you don't like either one, this is one of the nastiest things you'll ever put in your mouth. So the reason why I think it's a great metaphor is because it's a fascinating thing, it's kind of weird, and I think the presidency can be that way for us, right? It's a fascinating thing no matter what. Even if sometimes we think it's disgusting, it's still a fascinating thing. And I think our presidents are in this pickle. And the savviest presidents have used food as a way to connect with the American people. Here's the earliest picture that we have of the White House staff, and this was taken in spring of 1877. Now, does anyone know who was president spring of 1877? Oh, who? No? Hayes. Rutherford B. Hayes. Yes. Are you a history professor? No, okay, just about. All right. So, as you can see, the entire staff is African American, and this woman here, named Winnie Monroe, was the White House cook. For most of White House history, White House cooks have been accidental. They have, for the majority, have been African American, but a lot of them have either been enslaved, because we've had a lot of slaveholding presidents, or they've been the longtime family cook of somebody who becomes president. And that was the case with Winnie Monroe. She was cooking for the Hayeses back in Ohio. So the first person I'm going to talk about is Samuel Francis. And I know you're thinking, like, didn't he say this was about black chefs in the White House? That dude is kind of white looking. Well, anyway, his race has been contested for centuries, but his descendants believe him to have African ancestry. So he was a biracial man, and he is the first presidential steward. So the steward was the person who was in charge of all the domestic operations. They oversaw everything. They did the shopping, they did the hiring, they made sure the funds were allocated. They just ran all of the residence operations. And so George Washington picks him to be the first presidential steward. Today we call that person the chief usher. All right, but that steward was the old term for that. So Francis was born in the West Indies. We're not sure if he was born in Haiti or Jamaica. And he makes his way to New York in the 1750s, and pretty soon he starts running businesses. In fact, if you go to New York today, you can see a replica of the tavern that he ran called Francis Tavern on 54 Pearl Street, so like Pearl and Broad in Lower Manhattan. But one of his famous patrons was General George Washington. And Washington loved his cooking, and after when he becomes president, he asks Francis to be the first presidential steward. So the first story that I'm going to tell you tonight is what I call the poisoned pea plot of 1776. Now, I don't know if you learned about this in school, but essentially, like every other president, George Washington had his favorite foods. One of his favorite foods were green peas. He loved green peas so much that his contemporaries called him P. Diddy. Okay, I'm just kidding. See, that joke was just right there. I just had to, all right. So this is not actually just, whole peas. This is actually a mint pea green soup. The recipe is in my book. This is a favorite of Laura Bush, and I took this picture at the George W. Bush Library, Presidential Library in Dallas. It's a great dish, so I decided to use that just to kind of connect the old with the new. But here's how the story goes. Francis's daughter, a woman named Phoebe, is one day making dinner for the general, and there was a guy named Thomas Hickey who was not feeling all this revolutionary talk. And he distracts Phoebe and puts a little extra seasoning in the green peas that are being sent to the general. Phoebe immediately senses that something is going on, and she alerts her father, and he immediately discerns that this is an attempt to poison George Washington. So he bursts from the kitchen, and the story goes that as the general's just about to eat the peas, he grabs the plate of peas and throws it out the window. At that precise moment, a chicken was walking by outside, pecks at the peas and dies. So due to that animal testing, they realized that the peas were poisoned. Now, it's a fantastic story, but it's probably not true for several reasons. One, Francis did have daughters, but there was no one named Phoebe. Now, it could have been a nickname, but there's no one named Phoebe. Now, there was a guy named Thomas Hickey, and he was hanged later that summer, but his crime was counterfeiting, not attempted assassination. His crime was for forging passes that may have allowed some unsavory characters to be in General Washington's presence and probably could have tried to assassinate him. So for those reasons, it's probably not true. But ladies and gentlemen, if this story is true, it is the first example of culinary homeland security in our great nation. The next person I want to tell you about is Hercules. Hercules was an enslaved chef for George Washington. He's purchased as a young man, and he was actually a boat ferryman. But for whatever reason, George Washington has him assigned to the kitchen at Mount Vernon. And he apprentices under the longtime cook, another enslaved woman named Old Doll. Now, when Washington moves from New York to Philadelphia, because as the D.C. was being built, that's where our nation's capital was, a temporary capital, George Washington first hires a white woman named Mrs. Reed to be the cook. But evidently her food was nasty, because she only lasts about 6 months. So Washington has Hercules and other enslaved people from Mount Vernon brought to Philadelphia to staff the residence and the kitchen. There was only one problem. Pennsylvania had something called the Gradual Abolition Act of 1780. And under that law, if you were an enslaved person on Pennsylvania soil for 6 months, On that 6 months, you're automatically free. So what Washington did to get around that is that just about the time the 6-month deadline was about to toll, he would pack up all the enslaved people and send them back to Mount Vernon, leave them there for a few weeks, and then bring them back. And he alternates this throughout his presidency. I know, messed up, right? So that's what happened. But Hercules was well known in his time. There are diary accounts of his food. He was known as a temperamental chef, and there are accounts of basically his assistants flying in all directions at his instruction. Kind of reminds me of Gordon Ramsay, you know, the guy on Hell's Kitchen. But towards the end of Washington's presidency, let me just back up. He was also afforded a lot of liberties. Washington would let him go to the opera. He would let him actually walk around town and kind of dressed up. And then he also let him sell leftovers. This brother was making $2,000 a year in the 1790s selling leftovers out of the Washington kitchen. That's impressive, right? Okay. So, but towards the end of Washington's presidency, Washington suspects that Hercules is trying to escape. And the reason why is because Hercules' younger son, Richmond, who was also a part-time cook in Philadelphia, was caught with a bunch of money. And so they thought, Washington was thinking this was to finance an escape trip. When confronted, Hercules denied the whole thing, and he actually flipped the script and said, I can't believe you would even accuse me of trying to run away. So Washington sends him back to Mount Vernon, but not to the kitchen. He ends up in the fields making bricks and doing hard labor, this world-renowned chef. And so on Washington's 65th birthday, Hercules escapes. And where he ultimately goes, we don't know, because as history has shown, Washington was a very temperamental man, very angered very easily, and when slaves escaped, he did everything he could to try to retrieve them, even using trickery. In fact, if you go back through the letters of Washington at the time of Hercules' escapes, to me it's very clear that he's going through the 5 stages of grief, just looking through his letters. And I can't but help think of that song from Frozen, you know, that Let It Go song, but he couldn't let it go. Now, we have one clue, or some clues, about where Hercules may have gone. If you look at the clothing here, and the hat, this is actually the clothing of a chef in Europe at that time period, not an American chef. And this is from an actual painting hanging in a museum in Madrid, Spain, called George Washington's Cook, painted by Gilbert Stuart. All right, so people believe that he may have sat in Europe for this, but nobody knows for sure. The last time that he is seen is after George Washington's death in New York City. A guy named Colonel Varick, who was one of Washington's personal secretaries and now is mayor of New York, actually spots Hercules and writes to Martha Washington asking if she wants him to be retrieved, but she never writes back. And so the last thing we hear of Hercules is that there was a guy from France traveling around America, and in his diary he talks about going to Mount Vernon and meeting one of Hercules' daughters. And he asks her, are you sad for Hercules? She says, no, I'm happy, for he is free. So that's Hercules. Another gentleman is James Hemings, who was one of the older brothers of Sally Hemings. And Jefferson brings him to France while Jefferson is minister of France and spends a ton of money to have him trained as a classical French chef. And exorbitant amount of money. This is actually an inventory of kitchen utensils written in Hemings' own hand. And so he spends several years in France, and then he becomes the chef de cuisine in Paris for Jefferson. And then when they come back to the United States, he's Jefferson's chef for a little while. But then in 1795, he actually says to Jefferson, I want to be free. And Jefferson agrees to do this on 2 conditions. One, that Hemings teach the other enslaved cooks at Monticello how to make the food that he spent so much money getting taught, learning. And then the second thing is that he had to write down all his recipes. So Hemings agrees to do this, and he is freed in 1796. He certainly would have become the first White House chef, probably the first African-American White House chef, but he ends up drinking himself to death shortly before Jefferson becomes president. One thing we know is that Thomas Jefferson loved macaroni and cheese. He had a macaroni and cheese Jones, and macaroni and cheese was a very elite dish at that time because the Durham noodles to make macaroni were very expensive, and so was the Parmesan cheese. The earliest recipes for macaroni and cheese go back all the way to 1394 in the go-to cookbook for Queen Elizabeth I and Richard II. And the early recipe was just the pasta, some Parmesan cheese, and some butter. Things change because American farmers figure out how to grow the durum wheat, and they also get good at making cheddar. And if you go back to the early cheddars, they were very similar to Parmesan in terms of texture. That's why it gets substituted, and that's why our mac and cheese is pretty much cheddar based. So Jefferson loves mac and cheese so much that as he's packing up at the end of his stint as minister to France, he actually smuggles a macaroni maker out of Europe back to the United States. And smuggled is the right term because the Italians had it on lockdown. They didn't want anybody making macaroni. And so Jefferson, with his curious mind, draws a schematic of the macaroni maker in his own hand. And this is in the Library of Congress. But we know that macaroni and cheese was served in the White House because on February 6, 1802, a man named Reverend Manasseh Cutler, who was also a U.S. representative to Congress from Massachusetts, wrote about a dinner that he went to at the White House. And he had macaroni and cheese. Now, Cutler had no idea what this was in front of him. He thought the macaroni noodles were giant onions. He couldn't make sense of it. He asked the guy next to him to explain this dish, and the guy explained it to him. That guy happened to be Meriwether Lewis from the Lewis and Clark expedition. So he was sitting next to him at this dinner. But Cutler was not feeling mac and cheese. When he writes in his diary, he said that it had a strong taste and was disagreeable. But you see macaroni and cheese throughout White House history. It's definitely one of the favorites. In fact, it was a favorite of Reagan. So you just see it all over the place. Now let's fast forward and talk about one of the free cooks. And this was after emancipation. So the woman here in the middle is Laura Dolly Johnson. That picture was taken in the summer of 1890. And she was a cook for a colonel in Kentucky, a guy named John Mason Brown. And it just so happened that a young Theodore Roosevelt was having dinner at Brown's house. And so when Benjamin Harrison becomes president, he actually recommends to Harrison to hire Dolly Johnson. Now, Dolly Johnson was not enthusiastic about going to the White House. She actually wanted to start her own catering business, but she does end up taking that job. There was only one problem. There was already somebody in the White House position as head cook. Her name was Madame Pélunard. Madame Pélunard was not happy with the headlines announcing Dolly Johnson's hire. There were national headlines about this. So this very French cook has a very American response. First, she goes to the press and starts bad-mouthing the eating habits of the Harrisons. Chief among their culinary sins was that they ate a lot of pie. That was one of the things that she dogged them out about. But the second thing she does is she files a lawsuit. This is the first example of a White House staffer suing the president for lost wages. It gets resolved and never goes to court, but I just thought that was pretty fascinating. But Dolly Johnson, famous Kentucky cook, she was known for a lot of her foods and just very celebrated. Now, she only cooks for the Harrisons for 6 months because her daughter falls ill. So she returns to Lexington, Kentucky to care for her daughter. But when Grover Cleveland becomes president, he actually reaches out to her. There's a little negotiation back and forth, and she comes back and she works for Grover Cleveland in the White House as well. She is also one of the few examples of an African-American White House chef trading on their notoriety after they leave their White House. This is an actual newspaper ad from a Lexington, Kentucky newspaper. After she finishes with Grover Cleveland, she actually goes back to Lexington and opens up a restaurant. So you can see here, Dolly, the famous White House cook, has opened a dining room. So I thought that was just shows her ingenuity. For those of you who got a recipe card, I gave you Caroline Harrison's deviled almond recipe, which is just almonds, butter, and cayenne pepper. We don't have any recipes directly ascribed to Dolly, but she certainly would have made that while working for Caroline Harrison. And there's the deviled almonds. The last time we hear about Dolly Johnson is actually when Alice Roosevelt gets married to Nicholas Longworth. So it's a big time wedding. And so Dolly Johnson actually makes a pecan cake and sends it to the White House. And it was very well received. But Dolly Johnson just was a very fascinating figure. All right, now there is this question about what happens when the president travels. So I decided to tell the story of Daisy Bonner, who was a cook in Warm Springs, Georgia. And when Franklin Delano Roosevelt would get treatments for his polio, he would actually go to Warm Springs and spend 2 to 3 weeks there. So one of the wealthy families loaned their African-American cook to the Roosevelts in order, just to ingratiate themselves with him and make sure that he had a good time. So Daisy Bonner and FDR got along really well. Daisy Bonner was known for a lot of Southern delicacies. One thing that she definitely got FDR hooked on was pig's feet. This is a pig's foot from a place called the Florida Avenue Grill in Washington, D.C., and it's the oldest soul food restaurant in the world now. But this is how much FDR loved pig's feet. He actually serves them in the White House to Winston Churchill. And we know this because the African-American butler, a guy named Alonzo Fields, who you'll hear about a little bit later, wrote about it in his memoirs. So FDR served him sweet and sour pig's feet, which was a recipe he got from the Princess of Norway. And Winston Churchill is eating this, and FDR says, "So, how do you like them?" And Churchill says, "Well, it's got an interesting texture, kind of slimy." And FDR says, "Oh, okay, well, next time we'll have them fried." And I guess Winston Churchill's face said it all, because he looked at him and said, "I don't think I would like them fried." And they just started laughing. But just to get back to this story, you probably heard stories about FDR's food at the time in the White House, that it just did not have a great reputation. In fact, the food was so bad, and I think a lot of this had to do with rationing and other factors, but the food was so bad that if you got an invitation to eat at the White House, you might eat beforehand. That's how bad it was. Now, I was puzzled by this because I thought, well, you know, for the most part, they had a black cooking staff, so why was the food so nasty? Well, the answer is basically a woman named Henrietta Nesbitt. Is there anybody in the audience related to Henrietta Nesbitt? All right, I shall proceed. Okay, so Eleanor Roosevelt was fundamentally uninterested in food, and so she delegated everything to this woman named Henrietta Nesbitt, who ran a bakery shop in upstate New York. They met while Roosevelt was governor of New York, and she just admired Nesbitt's pluck and just put her in charge of all the food operations. But Nesbitt didn't really know that much about cooking, although she thought she did. So from the staff memoirs, we find out that what Nesbitt would do is she would come down into the kitchen, and then the black cooks would make everything, season it well, and then Henrietta Nesbitt would come in right behind them and mess everything up, and then have the plates sent out to the president. So when the president got away from the White House and to Warm Springs, Georgia, and was able to have food the way that Daisy Bonner made it, he just loved it. And she got him hooked on all kinds of Southern delicacies. The last day of his life, he was going to have a cheese souffle. Now, the cheese souffle was timed to be served at 1:15, but he has his fatal cerebral hemorrhage at 1:12, so he never actually eats the souffle. Now, has anybody here ever made a souffle? Okay, what is the thing you worry the most about when you're having a souffle? Falling, right? Ladies and gentlemen, I'm about to tell you a miracle, one that will rattle your soul and your belly. According to Daisy Bonner, on that day, that souffle did not fall for 2 hours until FDR was officially pronounced dead. Now, the recipe's in the book, and I've made the souffle. I can just tell you this, it doesn't stay up for 2 hours. But Daisy Bonner was so moved that she actually is the one who calls the White House switchboard to tell them about FDR, what happened to FDR. And if you go to Warm Springs today, they still have the little White House, they call it, the kitchen area. On the wall, you'll see a sign with some plastic covering something that Daisy Bonner wrote. And she wrote, "Daisy Bonner cooked first and last meal for President Roosevelt." That's how moved she was. Just to tell you another quick souffle story, President Kennedy was notorious for being late for meals. And he also liked a souffle, and his French chef, René Verdon, liked making souffles for him. So René Verdon's solution to JFK's tardiness was to make 4 souffles, and he cooked them at 15-minute intervals, hoping that JFK would show up on time. That was his solution. Yeah. And just to reinforce how much FDR loved pig's feet, at the little White House, if you go and look around the exhibit, they actually have the shopping list from his last week of life preserved. And on that list, it says 4 hog's feet. All right, so that's how much he loved them. And the way that Daisy Bonner would make them is that she would broil them, split them, and butter them. That's probably how you have them at home, right? Okay. Yeah, used to. So then I wrote a chapter about drinks, because one of the longest running cat and mouse games in White House history is whether or not our president gets their drink on. We seem to be very worried if our president drinks a lot of hard alcohol. We might be okay with wine, but cocktails, those are just the worst, right? We don't like a president who drinks a lot of cocktails. So this story involves Alonzo Fields, who was a White House maitre d'. And over the course of White House history, it first starts being run kind of like a plantation big house. And then after emancipation, it's run very much like a wealthy person's home. And then it transitions to be running more like a hotel. And so maitre d' actually becomes a very important position in the White House, almost akin to a White House steward. So this man, Alonzo Fields, comes to the White House during the Hoover administration and stays on through Eisenhower. But one of his roles was to make drinks. And so the Trumans, when they came in the White House, they loved the old-fashioned cocktail. Does anybody here know what it's in an old-fashioned? Okay, what's in an old-fashioned, sir?
Bourbon, anise, bitters, muddled sweets like fruits of some type, and sugar.
That's very good. Did you have one just before you came over here?
Brand new restaurant opened and I got to taste it.
All right, that's basically it. So the first time that the Trumans asked for an old-fashioned cocktail, Fields makes his favorite recipe. Bess Truman takes one sip and says, Fields, next time, can you make this a little drier? We're not used to our old fashions being so sweet. All right? So Fields does this the next time that they ask for one. Bess Truman takes another sip. She says, this tastes like fruit punch. So she wasn't happy with the new configuration. So this time, Fields is a little annoyed, a little angry. So when the Trumans ask for old fashioned, he decides to give them ice and 2 splashes of bourbon. Bess Truman takes one sip, looks at Fields and says, now that's how we like our old fashions. This gentleman is John Ficklin. He's a longtime White House butler. And the interesting thing about him is that he actually becomes the sommelier at the White House. So when I talked about stewards, for a long time in our White House history, biracial men were the White House stewards, and pretty much uninterrupted from, say, Lincoln all the way to Theodore Roosevelt. And then also, additionally, black men were in charge of White House wine. They were in charge of maintaining the wine cellar. And the wine cellar is not this big cavernous space in the White House. It really is like almost like a walk-in closet with a few bottles. Don't think of a big collection. And so by the time we get to President Ford, John Ficklin is actually in charge of the wine. And he does not get a great reputation for being in charge of the wine. Some of the newspaper articles at that time had headlines that said things like, White House serves second-rate wines, or White House wine leaves much to be desired. And part of this was because Ficklin, instead of just picking French wines all the time, he actually tried to get wines from across the country and celebrate regional wines, which is very in vogue today. But back then, it was a little bit more controversial. So the conference chairman for the American Wine Institute decides to write a letter to buck up Ficklin's courage. And I'm going to read you this letter. And I found that in the archives, this letter in the archives here. It says, Dear Mr. Ficklin, you're to be congratulated for your recommendations of American, particularly Eastern United States, wines to the President for service at official functions. Recent newspaper criticisms of your actions are uninformed and ill-advised. I am told several of the people quoted have not even tasted the wines they criticized. As chairman of the Society's 1975 annual conference, I would like to invite you to address our group on November 8th. The conference will be held at the Carousel Inn in Cincinnati. Our members will be very interested in learning of your experience in receiving your judgments of American wines. We sincerely hope you will be able to accept our invitation. There's no record of Ficklin actually going, but I just thought it was kind of cool to have that letter written. John Ficklin is basically in the White House from Eisenhower to all the way to President Reagan. He gets diagnosed with cancer, and so he retires from his service at the White House. But at one of the state dinners for the leader of Saudi Arabia, President Reagan actually invites John Ficklin and his wife to be guests of honor. And so they get to make it to that state dinner before he dies. But another fascinating figure. All right, another example of kind of a longtime confidant servant who comes to the White House is a guy named John Money, who is actually the valet for General Eisenhower during World War II. And so after the war, Money and Dwight Eisenhower stayed connected, and when Eisenhower becomes president, he asks John Money to be his valet. But because Eisenhower was such a great cook and loved to cook, Money ends up doing a lot of cooking in the White House as well. I love this picture because I would have to say that Eisenhower is probably the most grillingest president we had. In fact, he has a grill installed on the 3rd floor of the White House. So imagine people walking by on Pennsylvania Avenue, they see smoke coming out of the White House. It's the president up there grilling. So I just love this picture because Money would often staff him while he was grilling. Within the White House, there was something called Moni's stew, although outside of the White House, it was known as Ike's stew. But this was a very beef-laden vegetable stew that Eisenhower became famous for. In fact, in the 1956 election cycle, the White House printed up a bunch of recipe cards for this stew, and they actually sent it out across the country. And the idea was that housewives would have stew parties, invite their neighbors over, have some of this stew, and then they would tell them more about Eisenhower. I think that's brilliant. That could have worked in this last cycle, I think, you know? Could add some Trump steaks. Okay, never mind. But inside the White House, this was known as Moni's stew because he was often the one that was doing a lot of the prep work and making it. So I just thought that was kind of a cool story about the stew. All right, Zephyr Wright. Zephyr Wright is the longtime cook for Lyndon Johnson. If there was one person I really wish I could have met, it's Zephyr Wright. She gets hired by the family in the 1940s, and she cooks for them all the way until LBJ becomes president. In fact, many ascribe LBJ's rise in Congress to her cooking. I'm about to tell you something really shocking. There was a time when members of Congress would have each other over for dinner, and they would get to know each other and become collegial. So, I know, really. So people would never turn down an invitation to have Zephyr Wright's cooking. So fast forward, LBJ is president. He's now pushing for the 1964 Civil Rights Act, and he would often use Zephyr Wright's Jim Crow experiences in the South to persuade members of Congress to support that legislation. Because at that time, the family would drive back and forth from Central Texas to Washington, D.C., and Zephyr Wright, after suffering so many indignities on the trips, just refused to make the ride. So she stayed in Washington full time. So the president would often just use her stories to get people to support the bill. And when he signs the bill, he gives her one of the pins and says, "You deserve this as much as anyone." And Zephyr Wright was also an example of how these cooks were reluctant civil rights advocates. The president would often ask her, "How do black people feel about what I'm doing?" And he wanted to make sure he was getting enough credit for what he was doing. But often when civil rights leaders couldn't get the president's ear, they would go to Zephyr Wright. And in other administrations, we see this with the cooks. They would go to the cooks and ask them to say something to the president. So we see that dynamic quite a bit. Now, there was one example of where Zephyr Wright gets the president in hot water. And what I'm going to describe now is something I call the Great Chili Controversy of 1964. All right, do I have any Texans in the audience? None. Anybody who will claim it? All right. The distinctive thing about Texas chili is that it has no beans. You talk to somebody from Texas, they'll tell you that. So the White House releases a recipe for the Pedernales River chili. The Pedernales River is the river that runs alongside the ranch in central Texas, and it didn't have any beans. And the nation freaked out. They wanted to be assured that their president liked beans. So I am about to play a tape recording, recorded on the White House recording system, of the social secretary of the time, a woman named Juanita Roberts, and Zephyr Wright talking about the president's bean preferences, all right? So this is, I think until my book came out, I don't think a lot of people knew about this tape. And just a little history on the White House taping system. It was first installed under John F. Kennedy. Then Lyndon Johnson greatly ramped up its use, and he's the one who actually recommends it to Nixon, and we know how that turned out. So the first voice you're going to hear is that of Juanita Roberts.
We have correspondents asking us if the president and the family like beans. Well, I know enough to say yes. But I wanted to check with you. What would you say if you were asked that question by a responsible person?
Oh, I would say yes.
And
They didn't ask what kind, did they?
no, but I know that he particularly likes pork and beans.
He like pork and beans, like pinto beans. He like lima beans, green beans,
That's green limas are dried.
green limers.
Green.
Mm-hmm.
And the green, fresh green beans.
Mm-hmm.
Uh-huh.
And he liked the Blue Lake canned green beans, marinated, and use it as a salad.
Uh-huh.
Marinated in French dressing.
Uh-huh.
So
Yeah.
he liked, well, that's not a bean, though. That's a pea. I started to say green peas. But he just liked beans.
Now, the green llamas, you
The
don't...
baby llamas.
Green baby llamas. How do you prepare those for him?
Just in salted water and cook them and add a little oil, margarine, and pepper. And cook them for a good long while until the juice in them is kind of thick.
Yes. You used to use the Velveeta, but you don't do that anymore.
Well, I do that
for parties?
For parties. We use the Velveeta, also mushrooms. You know, you call it lima beans with cheese and mushroom sauce.
And the pintos, I guess you cook like I do, with salt pork or ham bones.
That's right.
And pork and beans, do you doctor them up?
Not for him. He like them just plain. He doctors them himself with some kind of pepper sauce or something like that.
All right. Zephyr, do you know where any of the chili cards are, chili recipe cards?
I sure don't. I may have one or two here.
Well, somebody's got some, and I'll find them because I need that one also.
Okay.
Nice talking to you.
Okay.
Thank you a lot.
You're welcome.
Bye.
Bye.
All right, admit it. How many of you use Velveeta for special occasions? All right. So at the very end, they talked about the recipe cards. This is what the White House put out. Lady Bird Johnson, in her memoirs, said that was, in that year, that was the second most requested document from the federal government. The only thing that people asked for more was information on the newly formed Women and Children Nutrition Program. All right, so that just shows you the power of White House recipes. I just think it's a great story. Another story I'll tell about Zephyr Wright real quick is that LBJ had a heart attack in the late 50s, and so he was on a very strict diet, which he often broke. And one year, Senator William Fulbright from Arkansas, who was a staunch critic of LBJ over the Vietnam War, said that LBJ had an arrogance of power. And LBJ, consumed a lot of press, and he knew what people were saying about him. So he waited for the right moment, and at some social occasion, he confronts Fulbright, and he says, "Come over here, I want to talk to you." And he pulls out a note, and the note is written by Zephyr Wright. And I'm paraphrasing, but the note said, "Mr. President, you want to boss everyone around, but you don't seem to want to take care of yourself. So now I'm going to be your boss. You're going to eat what I put in front of you, and you're not going to complain." So he reads this to Fulbright, and he says, "How can I have an arrogance of power if my cook can talk to me like this?" But Zephyr Wright's time in the White House was not pleasant. She gained 50 pounds. LBJ was often very late, and sometimes he would show up with a lot of guests unexpectedly and demand that dinner be made. And so Zephyr Wright had a hard time coping with this. And if he showed up late with guests and wanted dinner in a short amount of time, Zephyr Wright's strategy was just to send out a lot of booze, and then people rarely complained, but that was her strategy. But she ends up announcing that she's going to leave the White House before LBJ actually announces that he's not going to run for re-election. And she ends up cooking for Linda Bird Johnson, the oldest daughter, for maybe a year or two, but then she just kind of drops out of the scene. Spends the rest of her time in Washington. And this is unusual because a lot of the family cooks go back with the family home, but she didn't do that. But she was a very fascinating person. She dies in 1987. So the next person I want to tell you about is an actual Ford person. So then when I talk about what happens when the president travels, I also talk about people on Air Force One. So the gentleman here is Lee Simmons, and he's what they call an Air Force steward. And essentially, for food service, there's a three-person team. You've got one person in charge of kind of reheating the food, because on an airplane, you can't really cook a lot. And you've got one person in charge of taking orders and another person in charge of making the drinks. And they rotate their duties. But Lee Simmons works for Ford. And initially, he was on the plane with Pat Nixon at first. And then eventually, he meets Gerald Ford and Betty Ford and gets assigned to Air Force One. He had actually tried to get on Air Force One before that, but due to racism, he was often blocked. But the fact that he got to know the First Lady and the family got him in to work on the airplane. But just to show you how they often look out for the president, I'm going to read you this story involving sneaking some food to the president. Now, a lot of our presidents show up in the White House on a diet, and it's usually the First Lady and the White House physician who have to enforce the diet. So one of the first stories I tell in my book is the story of William Taft, who was on a midnight train to Ohio. He was one of our largest presidents. And this train was a midnight train to Ohio. And after the train leaves the station, he goes to the conductor and says, "Excuse me, where's the dining car?" The conductor says, "Well, sir, this is an overnight train, so we don't have a dining car attached." And he says, "I'm the president of the United States. I want a dining car." So they stop in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania at midnight, attach a dining car, rouse a chef to cook lamb chops with mint jelly, just so the president can grub on some lamb chops. And the only reason this happens is because the White House physician and the First Lady aren't on the train that night. So here's another example involving Simmons. From my book. It says, as part of his official duties, Simmons did what he could to satisfy President Ford's craving for butter pecan ice cream while playing a cat and mouse game with the White House physician. Air Force One always had ice cream on board when President Ford flew, Simmons said. One day, White House physician Dr. William Lukash put Mr. Ford on a diet and sent us a list of proper foods, and butter pecan ice cream was not on it. By a mistake, a lunch tray was handed to the president with butter pecan ice cream on it. President Ford ate it up before touching anything else on the tray and told us not to tell Dr. Lukash. And I said, after all, that's what friends are for. And I say friends because, interestingly, Lee Simmons actually becomes friends with the president. The president would be out on trips and he would be informal. He would invite guests to the table and introduce Lee Simmons. And Lee Simmons actually ends up working for the Fords 10 years after the presidency ends. Lee Simmons is still alive. He's been in touch with me. He would love for me to write his biography. He's in failing health, so I'm hoping we can get that done before he passes on. But he's a very, very nice man. Very, very interesting man. But just an example of kind of how these cooks play a lot of different roles. And I think family, friends, and confidants is certainly one of them. Another cook that I talk about is a woman named Wanda Joel. Wanda is the first African American to serve on Air Force One. And she serves on Air Force One from George Herbert Walker Bush to President Obama. And she, again, was part of the food service team. She was known for King's Hawaiian bread French toast. That was her specialty, and I have the recipe in my book. But fascinating woman, and she was on the plane on 9/11. So she shares a little bit of her experiences there. And then at the end of the book, I talk about what's the future of African American presidential chefs. I mean, the good news is that any president can pick any person they want to be the White House chef, and it's done deal. So at any point in the future, an African American could become the White House chef. The last person kind of offered that job was Patrick Clark, a well-known chef in New York. He cooked at Tavern on the Green in Odeon. He was so well respected that even Anthony Bourdain, who does not suffer fools, gave him a lot of love in his first book. So he didn't know this, but eventually he moves from New York to Washington, D.C., and he's working at the Hay Adams Hotel. And the Clintons come to have a meal, and they love his food. And then they start sending senior staffers over to try his food. So he was auditioning for the White House chef job. He gets offered the job, but he turns it down. Why? Because he was making too much money at the hotel compared to the White House job. How much do you think the White House executive chef was paid at that time? Just a guess. 60, that's very close, $58,000. He was making six figures at the hotel. And he had 4 kids growing up, so he just doesn't take the job. A couple years later, when the Clintons are hosting a state dinner for Republic of South Africa President Nelson Mandela, they asked Patrick Clark to devise the meal. So he creates the meal, and I have the meal in my book, and essentially the main dish was a sesame wasabi crusted halibut with a red curry and lemongrass dressing on some vegetables, and he was trying to replicate the flavors of South Africa. And at the very last minute, the Clintons say, "You're not cooking this meal." And he said, "What do you mean?" They said, "No, we want you to be a guest of honor." So he actually gets to sit at the table and have his sous chefs make the meal. But those recipes are in my book if you want to try it at home. And then the very last person I talk about is Kiana Farkas. Kiana is a young lady from Colorado who was the 2014 representative to the kids' state dinners that Michelle Obama would have. As part of her Let's Move initiative, she would have an annual healthy recipe contest. And so a winner was picked from every state, and they would come to the White House for this thing called the Kids State Dinner. So I thought it would be kind of cool to find African Americans who represented their states. And lo and behold, there was one from Colorado. So yes, Colorado does have black people, in case you're wondering. So Kiana's dish was a grilled salmon with warm farro salad. I was very impressed. At her age, I was making matzo meal. I mean, that was the height of my But from that experience, Kiana is on fire. She is thinking now about being a White House chef herself. I mean, she's so bright, she could become president. But she's really on fire for food justice. She wants to address this situation called food deserts, parts of communities that don't have access to healthy food. She really wants to take that on. So very impressive young lady. I will have to say that Kiana was probably the most challenging and difficult interview to get for my book. And the reason is, I used to date her mom and it did not end well. When I've made the connection, I thought, what are the chances? My friend said, yeah, pretty good. All right, so the work is ongoing. I keep finding out more information. At some of my talks, the descendants of some of the people I write about have come and shared more stories. So I have a blog. I'm not blogging regularly yet because I'm on the road a lot, but eventually I want to capture these stories and maybe even come out with a revised edition. But yes, follow my work on Soul Food Scholar on Facebook, or you can follow me on Instagram or Twitter at Soul Food Scholar. This first row, you look like you're on Instagram all the time, so make sure you follow me. All right. But thank you so much for being here, and I'll take your questions. And one thing I want to say, I forgot to mention this, is that over time, not only were these culinary artists that were celebrating their time, but they were family confidants. In many cases, they were civil rights advocates. And I think their main role is that they gave our presidents a window on black life that they may not have otherwise had. And not every president chose to open that window and take a look, but several did, and I think our nation's better for it because they did. So I forgot to make that point. So take your questions.
Thank you for your talk. What are the criteria for honoring someone with a state dinner? And are the preparations for a state dinner different?
Yes, so the question is, what are the requirements for the state dinner? So because the White House kitchen is so small, they actually have to hire extra staff for the state dinners. And so they have to go through the standard security check clearance that everybody else has to. I'll tell you a story. I don't know if this is true, but I'll just pass this on because I talked to somebody who was hired as one of those additional chefs. He said that his friend was not brought on because of his last name. His last name was Sniper. Now, I think that's really, that just seems ridiculous to me, but that's what he said. So what they do is they hire, I don't know the exact number of chefs they hire, but they hire quite a few, and they hire a lot more wait staff to do it. So there is a protocol for state dinners, and it depends on who's coming. And usually the State Department is heavily involved in the initial planning. But from the White House kitchen perspective, they have to make sure that they have the food taboos, desires, and allergies all covered before they put out the final menu. But there's usually several months involved before they do a state dinner. And the difference between a state dinner and a head of state dinner is whoever is the supreme ruler of a country, that's when they do a state dinner. And so the most obvious example is Great Britain. So if Queen or King comes over, state dinner. If it's the majority leader, Parliament, then it's a head of state dinner. Okay, that's the difference. Yes, sir.
My question is the White House kitchen on call 24 hours a day? And how much leeway does the cook have in making the menu? Is it totally their choice? Or can the president wake up one day and say, this is what I want for dinner?
Yes. So great question. So the White House is on call. And what they do is the White House staff tends to be a small number of people because it's a small space. So you have the executive chef, a pastry chef, and you have 3 or 4 assistant chefs. So what they do is they work different shifts to make sure that somebody's available in case the first family has a need. And a lot of this is on high alert the first few months of a presidency, but after they figure out the family, they usually have it nailed. But yeah, the president can ask for anything, and the White House staff prides themselves on being ready for any food emergency. There have been some times where they haven't quite been prepared, and I'll give you 2 examples, both involving dairy products. When Eisenhower spent his first night in the White House, he asked for a dairy product that they didn't have. You want to guess what that was? This is 1950s, right? No? Wait. Yogurt. So he asked the butler for yogurt, and the butler kindly goes to the chief usher and says, the president wants yogurt, and the chief usher said, what's that? So they had to get in a limousine and actually try to find some yogurt. The other time was with the Nixons, actually. Pat Nixon asked for something, another dairy product, that they didn't have that wasn't readily available in 1970s. It's more popular now. Any guesses on that one? No? Cheese? What kind of cheese? Cottage cheese. And again, they had to get in the limo and do that. So, but yeah, they try to anticipate, and usually are briefed on what the president wants. But yes, technically, the president can ask whatever they want. If they can't get it right then, they find a way to do it. So yeah, they try to meet those needs. Yeah. Any other questions? No? Yes? What's your favorite soul food dish? What's my favorite soul food dish? So sorry about that. I'm a greens and black eyed peas guy. So the greens that I usually eat, and this is just what my mother made, I usually do mustard greens with turnip greens, and I use smoked turkey. Now in soul food, the 5 popular greens are collards, kale, mustard, turnip, and cabbage. So all of you who've discovered kale in the last 5 years or so, welcome to the party, because we've been eating them for about 300. Yeah. But that's what I like. Sometimes I'll do ham hocks, but usually I'm doing smoked turkey. Yes. So actually, until you get to the Truman administration, the president had to pay for his own food, his own cooks, pretty much everyone except the White House steward and some limited staff. The president had to pay for it out of their own pocket. It wasn't until Truman that you actually start getting a regular appropriation to cover that. So I think that explains why a lot of our presidents have been wealthy men, because they had to pay for all of that stuff. Now, for the ones who weren't wealthy, they found ways to cut corners. For instance, in terms of food costs, the way that President Lincoln and President Grant got around that was that they would do their shopping at the Army commissary in order to supply the White House kitchen. Another way, which I just found out today, is dealing with liquor. I didn't know this, but there is a memo in the Ford Library where the chief usher is corresponding with somebody about how liquor is running low at the White House. So what they do is they decide to use confiscated liquor from, yes, by the federal government. So I never knew that. If I had known that, I would have put that in my book. I thought that was great. So, yeah. Not moonshine. I just saw a lot of whiskey on the list. That's what I saw. Lots of different types of whiskey. Yeah. Go, yes.
What if the first family want to get up and make their own meal?
So if the first family wants to get up and make their own meals, they can do that. Now, let me explain. I didn't explain this earlier. There are several cooking spaces within the White House. So you have the basement kitchen, but then on the second floor, there's a private family kitchen. And that was created by Jacqueline Kennedy in 1961. And because they used to eat in the state dining room, but she felt that was too cavernous a space, so she wanted a more intimate space. So there's this first, and it used to be Margaret Truman's bedroom. And so that's what they turned into a kitchenette and a small dining space. And so a lot of times the family can cook up there. Now, when a first family comes into the White House, they can have the executive chef do everything, or they can hire a private chef. And the Obamas had a private chef named Sam Cass. But before that, the last president to have a private chef in the White House was Lyndon Johnson. Zephyr Wright, that woman I was talking about. So between that time, it was essentially the White House executive chef handled everything. So, yeah. So there are some times when you have the family cooking, and, there was a lot of press about Ford when he was in the White House, because he would toast his own English muffins and have orange juice and things like that. But you don't see that a lot. A lot of times the first family just lets somebody cook for them. That's what you say. All right. Oh.
Who was Lincoln's chef?
So Lincoln's chef was a woman named So a woman named Cornelia Mitchell, who was a holdover from James Buchanan. And then there was another woman named Mary Dines who cooked for Lincoln at the Summer Cottage, the old soldier home. So she cooked from there. And the way that she got the job is that Lincoln would go to the soldiers' home, and he would stop by and listen to a lot of the newly freed slaves basically singing old spirituals. And he was so moved by that. And Mary Dines happened to be one of the lead conductors. And so they got to talking, and eventually she gets the job. And the week after McClellan gets fired, he's writing a note to Mary Todd Lincoln about Mary and them grumbling about the old soldier home being too cold, and they want to be back at the White House. So, in the height of the war, he's dealing with all of these, domestic issues. So I just think it's pretty cool. Yeah. So Lincoln, he ate very sparingly, actually. There's a lot of talk about him eating, just picking at his food. But kind of, cabbage and cornbread, a lot of simple stuff. And I know he liked a molasses pecan pie as well. Those are two things that I documented. There's a lot of recipes floating around. I just don't know if they're authentic or not, like if he really, really liked them. But those were two things that his cook said that he liked. And maybe with some corned beef in the cabbage as well. But definitely cabbage and cornbread. All right. Oh, can we take one more? Okay, yes, sir. Oh, great question. Who does the grocery cook? So it changes over time. So in the earliest days, the White House steward would actually load up a wagon and go to open-air markets in D.C. Then for security reasons, the Secret Service takes that over. And believe it or not, there are a lot of times when the Secret Service will just go to a grocery store unannounced and shop, because sometimes that's the safest way to do it. But they usually have purveyors that handle the shopping. So there's like secured purveyors that provision the White House. And then there's the White House garden as well. Now, the other question I often get is whether or not the president has a taste tester to make sure that their food is not poisoned. And what I tell people is usually the opposition leader in Congress. Now, actually, it's the chef. The chef is the last person to taste the food that goes out to the president. So they're the taste tester. Yeah. All right, well, thank you so much. I hope you all get books. I'll be happy to sign them. Okay.
I told you that'd be a heap of fun, and this is what a great way to start our fall programs. For you, to help you sign your books, if I can open it, we have a set of pens with the signature of Gerald Ford for you to use, and we hope you use them. If I can, there you go. Use those and write with those in Great Hill. So thank you so much.
All right, thank you.
And we love it that you know. Everything that Adrian said about Lee Simmons is true. He's a fabulous man, and his wife is lovely, too. We have had the pleasure of knowing them, and I think it'd be great. So get on it and write his biography, because he's a fascinating man.
All right, thank you.
Thank you so much.
All right, thank
Great.
you.
Great. So tonight, we have a reception and a book signing out front. I mentioned a calendar, please pick one up. They're outside the door at the left side of the auditorium as you go out. Or check our website going forward. If you're not already on our email list, there are forms to sign up, or you can take forms to join Friends of Ford, again, because that's how these programs are made possible. So thank you for coming. This has been a lot of fun, and remember to come back for lots more this fall. Good to have you.